Book 2, Chapter 22. A party for the Blenkers? The Blenkers? Mr. Welland laid down his knife and fork and looked anxiously and incredulously across the luncheon table at his wife, who, adjusting her gold eyeglasses, read aloud, in the tone of high comedy, "Professor and Mrs. Emerson Sillerton request the pleasure of Mr. and Mrs. Welland's company at the meeting of the Wednesday Afternoon Club on August 25th at 3 o'clock punctually, to meet Mrs. and the Misses Blenker, Red Gables, Catherine Street, RSVP." "Good gracious!" Mr. Welland gasped, as if a second reading had been necessary to bring the monstrous absurdity of the thing home to him. "Poor Amy Sillerton! You never can tell what her husband will do next." Mrs. Welland sighed. "I suppose he's just discovered the Blenkers." Professor Emerson Sillerton was a thorn in the side of Newport society, and a thorn that could not be plucked out, for it grew on a venerable and venerated family tree. He was, as people said, a man who had had every advantage. His father was Sillerton Jackson's uncle, his mother a Pennilow of Boston. On each side there was wealth and position and mutual suitability. Nothing, as Mrs. Welland had often remarked, nothing on earth obliged Emerson Sillerton to be an archaeologist, or indeed a professor of any sort, or to live in Newport in winter, or do any of the other revolutionary things that he did. But at least, if he was going to break with tradition and flout society in the face, he need not have married poor Amy Dagonet, who had a right to expect something different and money enough to keep her own carriage. No one in the Mingott set could understand why Amy Sillerton had submitted so tamely to the eccentricities of a husband who filled the house with long-haired men and short-haired women, and, when he traveled, took her to explore tombs in Yucatan instead of going to Paris or Italy. But there they were, set in their ways, and apparently unaware that they were different from other people. And when they gave one of their dreary annual garden parties, every family on the cliffs, because of the Sillerton-Pennilow-Dagonet connection, had to draw lots and send an unwilling representative. "It's a wonder," Mrs. Welland remarked, "that they didn't choose the Race Cup day. Do you remember, 2 years ago, their giving a party for a black man on the day of Julia Mingott's the dancent? Luckily, this time there's nothing else going on that I know of, for, of course, some of us will have to go." Mr. Welland sighed nervously. "Some of us, my dear, more than one? 3 o'clock is such a very awkward hour. I have to be here at 3:30 to take my drops. It's really no use trying to follow Bencom's new treatment if I don't do it systematically, and if I join you later, of course I shall miss my drive." At the thought he laid down his knife and fork again, and a flush of anxiety rose to his finely wrinkled cheek. "There's no reason why you should go at all, my dear," his wife answered with a cheerfulness that had become automatic. "I have some cards to leave at the other end of Bellevue Avenue, and I'll drop in at about 3:30 and stay long enough to make poor Amy feel that she hasn't been slighted." She glanced hesitatingly at her daughter. "And if Newland's afternoon is provided for, perhaps May can drive you out with the ponies and try their new russet harness." It was a principle in the Welland family that people's days and hours should be what Mrs. Welland called provided for. The melancholy possibility of having to kill time, especially for those who did not care for whist or solitaire, was a vision that haunted her as the spectre of the unemployed haunts the philanthropist. Another of her principles was that parents should never, at least visibly, interfere with the plans of their married children, and the difficulty of adjusting this respect for May's independence with the exigency of Mr. Welland's claims could be overcome only by the exercise of an ingenuity which left not a second of Mrs. Welland's own time unprovided for. "Of course I'll drive with Papa. I'm sure Newland will find something to do," May said, in a tone that gently reminded her husband of his lack of response. It was a cause of constant distress to Mrs. Welland that her son-in-law showed so little foresight in planning his days. Often already, during the fortnight that he had passed under her roof, when she inquired how he meant to spend his afternoon, he had answered paradoxically, "Oh, I think for a change I'll just save it instead of spending it." And once, when she and May had had to go on a long postponed round of afternoon calls, he had confessed to having lain all the afternoon under a rock on the beach below the house. "Newland never seems to look ahead," Mrs. Welland once ventured to complain to her daughter, and May answered serenely, "No. But you see it doesn't matter, because when there's nothing particular to do, he reads a book." "Ah, yes, like his father," Mrs. Welland agreed, as if allowing for an inherited oddity, and after that the question of Newland's unemployment was tacitly dropped. Nevertheless, as the day for the Sillerton reception approached, May began to show a natural solicitude for his welfare, and to suggest a tennis match at the Chiverses, or a sail on Julius Beaufort's cutter, as a means of atoning for her temporary desertion. "I shall be back by 6, you know, dear. Papa never drives later than that." And she was not reassured till Archer said that he thought of hiring a runabout and driving up the island to a stud farm to look at a second horse for her brougham. They had been looking for this horse for some time, and the suggestion was so acceptable that May glanced at her mother as if to say, "You see, he knows how to plan out his time as well as any of us." The idea of the stud farm and the brougham horse had germinated in Archer's mind on the very day when the Emerson-Sillerton invitation had first been mentioned, but he had kept it to himself as if there was something clandestine in the plan, and discovery might prevent its execution. He had, however, taken the precaution to engage in advance a runabout with a pair of old livery-stable trotters that could still do their 18 miles on level roads, and at 2 o'clock, hastily deserting the luncheon table, he sprang into the light carriage and drove off. The day was perfect. A breeze from the north drove little puffs of white cloud across an ultramarine sky, with a bright sea running under it. Bellevue Avenue was empty at that hour, and after dropping the stable lad at the corner of Mill Street, Archer turned down the old beach road and drove across Eastman's Beach. He had the feeling of unexplained excitement with which, on half-holidays at school, he used to start off into the unknown. Taking his pair at an easy gait, he counted on reaching the stud farm, which was not far beyond Paradise Rocks, before 3 o'clock, so that, after looking over the horse, and trying him if he seemed promising, he would still have 4 golden hours to dispose of. As soon as he had heard of the Sillertons' party, he had said to himself that the Marchioness Manson would certainly come to Newport with the Blenkers, and that Madame Olenska might again take the opportunity of spending the day with her grandmother. At any rate, the Blenker habitation would probably be deserted, and he would be able, without indiscretion, to satisfy a vague curiosity concerning it. He was not sure that he wanted to see the Countess Olenska again, but ever since he had looked at her from the path above the bay he had wanted, irrationally and indescribably, to see the place she was living in, and to follow the movements of her imagined figure as he had watched the real one in the summer-house. The longing was with him day and night, an incessant, undefinable craving, like the sudden whim of a sick man for food or drink once tasted and long since forgotten. He could not see beyond the craving, or picture what it might lead to, for he was not conscious of any wish to speak to Madame Olenska, or to hear her voice. He simply felt that if he could carry away the vision of the spot of earth she had walked on, and the way the sky and sea enclosed it, the rest of the world might seem less empty. When he reached the stud farm, a glance showed him that the horse was not what he wanted. Nevertheless, he took a turn behind it in order to prove to himself that he was not in a hurry. But at 3 o'clock he shook out the reins over the trotters and turned into the by-roads leading to Portsmouth. The wind had dropped, and a faint haze on the horizon showed that a fog was waiting to steal up the Saconet on the turn of the tide. but all about him fields and woods were steeped in golden light. He drove past gray shingled farmhouses in orchards, past hayfields and groves of oak, past villages with white steeples rising sharply into the fading sky, and at last, after stopping to ask the way of some men at work in a field, he turned down a lane between high banks of goldenrod and brambles. At the end of the lane was the blue glimmer of the river. To the left, standing in front of a clump of oaks and maples, he saw a long, tumble-down house with white paint peeling from its clapboards. On the roadside facing the gateway stood one of the open sheds in which the New Englander shelters his farming implements and visitors hitch their teams. Archer, jumping down, led his pair into the shed, and after tying them to a post, turned toward the house. The patch of lawn before it had relapsed into a hayfield, but to the left an overgrown box garden full of dahlias and rusty rose bushes encircled a ghostly summer house of trellis work that had once been white, surmounted by a wooden cupid who had lost his bow and arrow but continued to take ineffectual aim. Archer leaned for a while against the gate. No one was in sight, and not a sound came from the open windows of the house. A grizzled Newfoundland dozing before the door seemed as ineffectual a guardian as the arrowless Cupid. It was strange to think that this place of silence and decay was the home of the turbulent Blinkers, yet Archer was sure that he was not mistaken. For a long time he stood there, content to take in the scene and gradually falling under its drowsy spell. But at length he roused himself to the sense of the passing time. Should he look his fill and then drive away? He stood irresolute, wishing suddenly to see the inside of the house, so that he might picture the room that Madame Olenska sat in. There was nothing to prevent his walking up to the door and ringing the bell. If, as he supposed, she was away with the rest of the party, he could easily give his name and ask permission to go into the sitting-room to write a message. But instead he crossed the lawn and turned into the box garden. As he entered it, he caught sight of something bright-colored in the summer-house, and presently made it out to be a pink parasol. The parasol drew him like a magnet. He was sure it was hers. He went into the summer-house, and sitting down on the rickety seat, picked up the silken thing and looked at its carved handle, which was made of some rare wood that gave out an aromatic scent. Archer lifted the handle to his lips. He heard a rustle of skirts against the box and sat motionless, leaning on the parasol handle with clasped hands, and letting the rustle come nearer without lifting his eyes. He had always known that this must happen. "Oh, Mr. Archer!" exclaimed a loud young voice, and looking up he saw before him the youngest and largest of the Blinker girls, blonde and blousy, in bedraggled muslin. A red blotch on one of her cheeks seemed to show that it had recently been pressed against a pillow, and her half-awakened eyes stared at him hospitably but confusedly. "Gracious, where did you drop from? I must have been sound asleep in the hammock. Everybody else has gone to Newport. Did you ring?" she incoherently inquired. Archer's confusion was greater than hers. No, that is, I was just going to. I had to come up the island to see about a horse, and I drove over on a chance of finding Mrs. Blinker and your visitors, but the house seemed empty, so I sat down to wait." Miss Blinker, shaking off the fumes of sleep, looked at him with increasing interest. "This house is empty. Mother's not here, or the Marchioness, or anybody but me." Her glance became faintly reproachful. "Didn't you know that Professor and Mrs. Sillerton are giving a garden party for Mother and all of us this afternoon? It was too unlucky that I couldn't go, but I've had a sore throat, and Mother was afraid of the drive home this evening. Did you ever know anything so disappointing? Of course," she added gaily, "I shouldn't have minded half as much if I'd known you were coming." Symptoms of a lumbering coquetry became visible in her, and Archer found the strength to break in, "But Madame Olenska, has she gone to Newport too?" Miss Blinker looked at him with surprise. "Madame Olenska? Didn't you know she'd been called away?" "Called away?" "Oh, my best parasol! I lent it to that goose of a Katy because it matched her ribbons, and the careless thing must have dropped it here. We Blenkers are all like that, real bohemians." Recovering the sunshade with a powerful hand, she unfurled it and suspended its rosy dome above her head. "Yes, Ellen was called away yesterday. She lets us call her Ellen, you know. A telegram came from Boston. She said she might be gone for 2 days. I do love the way she does her hair, don't you?" Miss Blenker rambled on. Archer continued to stare through her as though she had been transparent. All he saw was the trumpery parasol that arched its pinkness over her giggling head. After a moment he ventured, "You don't happen to know why Madame Olenska went to Boston? I hope it was not on account of bad news." Miss Blenker took this with a cheerful incredulity. "Oh, I don't believe so. She didn't tell us what was in the telegram. I think she didn't want the Marchioness to know. She's so romantic looking, isn't she? Doesn't she remind you of Mrs. Scott Siddons when she reads Lady Geraldine's Courtship? Did you never hear her?" Archer was dealing hurriedly with crowding thoughts. His whole future seemed suddenly to be unrolled before him, and passing down its endless emptiness he saw the dwindling figure of a man to whom nothing was ever to happen. He glanced about him at the unpruned garden, the tumble-down house, and the oak grove under which the dusk was gathering. It had seemed so exactly the place in which he ought to have found Madame Olenska, and she was far away, and even the pink sunshade was not hers. He frowned and hesitated. "You don't know, I suppose. I shall be in Boston tomorrow. If I could manage to see her—" He felt that Miss Blenker was losing interest in him, though her smile persisted. "Oh, of course. How lovely of you. She's staying at the Parker House. It must be horrible there in this weather." After that, Archer was but intermittently aware of the remarks they exchanged. He could only remember stoutly resisting her entreaty that he should await the returning family and have high tea with them before he drove home. At length, with his hostess still at his side, he passed out of range of the wooden Cupid, unfastened his horses, and drove off. At the turn of the lane he saw Miss Blenker standing at the gate and waving the pink parasol. Book 2, Chapter 23. The next morning, when Archer got out of the Fall River train, he emerged upon a steaming midsummer Boston. The streets near the station were full of the smell of beer and coffee and decaying fruit, and a shirt-sleeved populace moved through them with the intimate abandon of boarders going down the passage to the bathroom. Archer found a cab and drove to the Somerset Club for breakfast. Even the fashionable quarters had the air of untidy domesticity to which no excess of heat ever degrades the European cities. Caretakers in calico lounged on the doorsteps of the wealthy, and the common looked like a pleasure ground on the morrow of a Masonic picnic. If Archer had tried to imagine Ellen Olenska in improbable scenes, he could not have called up any into which it was more difficult to fit her than this heat-prostrated and deserted Boston. He breakfasted with appetite and method, beginning with a slice of melon and studying a morning paper while he waited for his toast and scrambled eggs. A new sense of energy and activity had possessed him ever since he had announced to May the night before that he had business in Boston and should take the Fall River boat that night and go on to New York the following evening. It had always been understood that he would return to town early in the week, and when he got back from his expedition to Portsmouth a letter from the office, which fate had conspicuously placed on a corner of the hall table, sufficed to justify his sudden change of plan. He was even ashamed of the ease with which the whole thing had been done. It reminded him, for an uncomfortable moment, of Lawrence Lefferts's masterly contrivances for securing his freedom. But this did not long trouble him, for he was not in an analytic mood. After breakfast he smoked a cigarette and glanced over the Commercial Advertiser. While he was thus engaged, 2 or 3 men he knew came in, and the usual greetings were exchanged. It was the same world, after all, though he had such a queer sense of having slipped through the meshes of time and space. He looked at his watch, and finding that it was 9:30, got up and went into the writing-room. There he wrote a few lines, and ordered a messenger to take a cab to the Parker House and wait for the answer. He then sat down behind another newspaper and tried to calculate how long it would take a cab to get to the Parker House. "The lady was out, sir," he suddenly heard a waiter's voice at his elbow, and he stammered, "Out?" as if it were a word in a strange language. He got up and went into the hall. It must be a mistake. She could not be out at that hour. He flushed with anger at his own stupidity. Why had he not sent the note as soon as he arrived? He found his hat and stick and went forth into the street. The city had suddenly become as strange and vast and empty as if he were a traveler from distant lands. For a moment he stood on the doorstep, hesitating. Then he decided to go to the Parker House. What if the messenger had been misinformed and she were still there? He started to walk across the common, and on the first bench under a tree he saw her sitting. She had a gray silk sunshade over her head. How could he ever have imagined her with a pink one? As he approached, he was struck by her listless attitude. She sat there as if she had nothing else to do. He saw her drooping profile, and the knot of hair fastened low in the neck under her dark hat, and the long wrinkled glove on the hand that held the sunshade. He came a step or two nearer, and she turned and looked at him. "Oh," she said, and for the first time he noticed a startled look on her face, but in another moment it gave way to a slow smile of wonder and contentment. "Oh," she murmured again, on a different note, as he stood looking down at her, and without rising she made a place for him on the bench. "I'm here on business, just got here," Archer explained, and without knowing why he suddenly began to feign astonishment at seeing her. "But what on earth are you doing in this wilderness?" He had really no idea what he was saying. He felt as if he were shouting at her across endless distances, and she might vanish again before he could overtake her. "I? Oh, I'm here on business too," she answered, turning her head toward him so that they were face to face. The words hardly reached him. He was aware only of her voice, and of the startling fact that not an echo of it had remained in his memory. He had not even remembered that it was low-pitched, with a faint roughness on the consonants. "You do your hair differently," he said, his heart beating as if he had uttered something irrevocable. "Differently? No, it's only that I do it as best I can when I'm without Nastasia." "Nastasia? But isn't she with you?" "No, I'm alone. For 2 days it was not worth while to bring her." "You're alone? At the Parker House?" She looked at him with a flash of her old malice. "Does it strike you as dangerous?" "No, not dangerous, but unconventional." "I see. I suppose it is." She considered a moment. "I hadn't thought of it, because I've just done something so much more unconventional." The faint tinge of irony lingered in her eyes. "I've just refused to take back a sum of money that belonged to me." Archer sprang up and moved a step or two away. She had furled her parasol and sat absently drawing patterns on the gravel. Presently he came back and stood before her. "Someone has come here to meet you?" "Yes." "With this offer?" She nodded. "And you refused because of the conditions?" "I refused," she said after a moment. He sat down by her again. "What were the conditions?" "Oh, they were not onerous. Just to sit at the head of his table now and then." There was another interval of silence. Archer's heart had slammed itself shut in that queer way it had, and he sat vainly groping for a word. "He wants you back at any price?" "Well, a considerable price. At least the sum is considerable for me." He paused again, beating about the question he felt he must put. "It was to meet him here that you came?" She stared, and then burst into a laugh. "Meet him? My husband? Here? At this season he's always at Cowes or Baden." He sent someone? Yes. With a letter? She shook her head. No, just a message. He never writes. I don't think I've had more than one letter from him. The illusion brought the color to her cheek, and it reflected itself in Archer's vivid blush. Why does he never write? Why should he? What does one have secretaries for? The young man's blush deepened. She had pronounced the word as if it had no more significance than any other in her vocabulary. For a moment it was on the tip of his tongue to ask, did he send his secretary then? But the remembrance of Count Olenski's only letter to his wife was too present to him. He paused again, and then took another plunge. And the person? The emissary? The emissary, Madame Olenska rejoined, still smiling, might, for all I care, have left already, but he has insisted on waiting till this evening, in case, on the chance— And you came out here to think the chance over. I came out to get a breath of air. The hotel's too stifling. I'm taking the afternoon train back to Portsmouth. They sat silent, not looking at each other, but straight ahead, the people passing along the path. Finally, she turned her eyes again to his face and said, You're not changed. He felt like answering, I was, till I saw you again. But instead he stood up abruptly and glanced about him at the untidy, sweltering park. This is horrible. Why shouldn't we go out a little on the bay? There's a breeze, and it will be cooler. We might take the steamboat down to Point Arley. She glanced up at him hesitatingly, and he went on. On a Monday morning there won't be anybody on the boat. My train doesn't leave till evening. I'm going back to New York. Why shouldn't we? He insisted, looking down at her. And suddenly he broke out, Haven't we done all we could? Oh, she murmured again. She stood up and reopened her sunshade, glancing about her as if to take counsel of the scene and assure herself of the impossibility of remaining in it. Then her eyes returned to his face. You mustn't say things like that to me, she said. I'll say anything you like, or nothing. I won't open my mouth unless you tell me to. What harm can it do to anybody? All I want is to listen to you, he stammered. She drew out a little gold-faced watch on an enameled chain. Oh, don't calculate, he broke out. Give me the day. I want to get you away from that man. At what time was he coming? Her color rose again. At 11. Then you must come at once. You needn't be afraid if I don't come. Nor you either if you do. I swear I only want to hear about you, to know what you've been doing. It's 100 years since we've met. It may be another 100 before we meet again. She still wavered, her anxious eyes on his face. Why didn't you come down to the beach to fetch me the day I was at Granny's? She asked. Because you didn't look round, because you didn't know I was there. I swore I wouldn't unless you looked round. He laughed as the childishness of the confession struck him. But I didn't look round on purpose. On purpose? I knew you were there. When you drove in, I recognized the ponies, so I went down to the beach. To get away from me as far as you could? She repeated in a low voice. To get away from you as far as I could. He laughed out again, this time in boyish satisfaction. Well, you see it's no use. I may as well tell you, he added, that the business I came here for was just to find you. But look here, we must start or we shall miss our boat. Our boat? She frowned perplexedly and then smiled. Oh, but I must go back to the hotel first. I must leave a note. As many notes as you please. You can write here. He drew out a note case and one of the new stylographic pens. I've even got an envelope. You see how everything's predestined. There, steady the thing on your knee, and I'll get the pen going in a second. They have to be humored. Wait. He banged the hand that held the pen against the back of the bench. It's like jerking down the mercury in a thermometer. Just a trick. Now try. She laughed, and bending over the sheet of paper which he had laid on his note case, began to write. Archer walked away a few steps, staring with radiant, unseeing eyes at the passers-by, who, in their turn, paused to stare at the unwanted sight of a fashionably dressed lady writing a note on her knee on a bench in the common. Madame Olenska slipped the sheet into the envelope, wrote a name on it, and put it into her pocket. Then she too stood up. They walked back toward Beacon Street, and near the club Archer caught sight of the plush-lined Herdic, which had carried his note to the Parker house, and whose driver was reposing from this effort by bathing his brow at the corner hydrant. "I told you everything was predestined. Here's a cab for us, you see." They laughed, astonished at the miracle of picking up a public conveyance at that hour, and in that unlikely spot, in a city where cab stands were still a foreign novelty. Archer, looking at his watch, saw that there was time to drive to the Parker house before going to the steamboat landing. They rattled through the hot streets and drew up at the door of the hotel. Archer held out his hand for the letter. "Shall I take it in?" he asked. But Madame Olenska, shaking her head, sprang out and disappeared through the glazed doors. It was barely 10:30, but what if the emissary, impatient for her reply and not knowing how else to employ his time, were already seated among the travelers with cooling drinks at their elbows, of whom Archer had caught a glimpse as she went in? He waited, pacing up and down before the Herdic. A Sicilian youth with eyes like Nastasia's offered to shine his boots, and an Irish matron to sell him peaches, and every few moments the doors opened to let out hot men with straw hats tilted far back, who glanced at him as they went by. He marveled that the door should open so often, and that all the people it let out should look so like each other, and so like all the other hot men who, at that hour, through the length and breadth of the land, were passing continuously in and out of the swinging doors of hotels. And then suddenly came a face that he could not relate to the other faces. He caught but a flash of it, for his pacings had carried him to the farthest point of his beat, and it was in turning back to the hotel that he saw, in a group of typical countenances, the lank and weary, the round and surprised, the lantern-jawed and mild, this other face that was so many more things at once, and things so different. It was that of a young man, pale, too, and half extinguished by the heat, or worry, or both, but somehow quicker, vivider, more conscious, or perhaps seeming so because he was so different. Archer hung a moment on a thin thread of memory, but it snapped and floated off with the disappearing face. Apparently that of some foreign businessman, looking doubly foreign in such a setting. He vanished in the stream of passers-by, and Archer resumed his patrol. He did not care to be seen, watch in hand, within view of the hotel, and his unaided reckoning of the lapse of time led him to conclude that, if Madame Olenska was so long in reappearing, it could only be because she had met the emissary and been waylaid by him. At the thought, Archer's apprehension rose to anguish. "If she doesn't come soon, I'll go in and find her," he said. The doors swung open again, and she was at his side. They got into the Herdic, and as it drove off he took out his watch and saw that she had been absent just 3 minutes. In the clatter of loose windows that made talk impossible, they bumped over the disjointed cobblestones to the wharf. Seated side by side on a bench of the half-empty boat, they found that they had hardly anything to say to each other, or rather that what they had to say communicated itself best in the blessed silence of their release and their isolation. As the paddle wheels began to turn, and wharves and shipping to recede through the veil of heat, it seemed to Archer that everything of the old familiar world of habit was receding also. He longed to ask Madame Olenska if she did not have the same feeling, the feeling that they were starting on some long voyage from which they might never return. But he was afraid to say it, or anything else that might disturb the delicate balance of her trust in him. In reality, he had no wish to betray that trust. There had been days and nights when the memory of their kiss had burned and burned on his lips. The day before, even, on the drive to Portsmouth, the thought of her had run through him like fire, but now that she was beside him, and they were drifting forth into this unknown world, they seemed to have reached the kind of deeper nearness that a touch may sunder. As the boat left the harbor and turned seaward, a breeze stirred about them, and the bay broke up into long, oily undulations, then into ripples tipped with spray. The fog of sultriness still hung over the city, but ahead lay a fresh world of ruffled waters and distant promontories with lighthouses in the sun. Madame Olenska, leaning back against the boat rail, drank in the coolness between parted lips. She had wound a long veil about her hat, but it left her face uncovered, and Archer was struck by the tranquil gaiety of her expression. She seemed to take their adventure as a matter of course, and to be neither in fear of unexpected encounters, nor, what was worse, unduly elated by their possibility. In the bare dining room of the inn, which he had hoped they would have to themselves, they found a strident party of innocent-looking young men and women, school-teachers on a holiday, the landlord told them, and Archer's heart sank at the idea of having to talk through their noise. "This is hopeless. I'll ask for a private room," he said, and Madame Olenska, without offering any objection, waited while he went in search of it. The room opened on a long wooden veranda, with the sea coming in at the windows. It was bare and cool, with a table covered with a coarse checkered cloth, and adorned by a bottle of pickles and a blueberry pie under a cage. No more guileless-looking cabinet particulier ever offered its shelter to a clandestine couple. Archer fancied he saw the sense of its reassurance in the faintly amused smile with which Madame Olenska sat down opposite to him. A woman who had run away from her husband, and reputedly with another man, was likely to have mastered the art of taking things for granted. But something in the quality of her composure took the edge from his irony. By being so quiet, so unsurprised, and so simple, she had managed to brush away the conventions and make him feel that to seek to be alone was the natural thing for two old friends who had so much to say to each other.